For about a decade now, since the release of Pokemon X and Y, each new Pokemon game has been defined by some new generational mechanic. Gen 6 introduced Mega Evolutions, Gen 7 it was V-Moves, in Generation 8 it was Dynamax, and finally in Generation 9 we have Terastallization. These new mechanics are flashy and interesting, and they help bring players into each new game. But these are not the only mechanics that have changed in the history of Pokemon games. The franchise has been around since 1996, and in that time we've gone from this to this. So for this video, I'd like to highlight a unique feature or mechanic from each generation of Pokemon. These are things that can only be found in a specific game or generation, and not in any generation before or after. So let's get right into it, starting with Generation 1, and making our way all the way to Generation 9.
Who's that Pokemon?
The first generation of Pokemon is definitely the odd one out when it comes to its mechanics. It's notorious for being riddled with glitches and bugs. Certain moves don't work the way they're intended, and overall you can tell that Game Freak was not 100% sure what it wanted to do with these games yet. Honestly, you could make a whole video just about weird Gen 1 mechanics, and many people have, but I want to highlight just one. It's commonly brought up in competitive battling circles that Hyper Beam is a great move in Generation 1, because if you KO a Pokemon, it skips the recharge turn. But it doesn't often get explained exactly why that is. In the first generation of Pokemon, if a Pokemon faints, the turn ends immediately, right then and there. This means that if you KO the enemy Pokemon with Hyper Beam, the turn ends right there, and the game doesn't get to run its end of turn check to see if you used Hyper Beam, so it can apply the recharge turn. But Hyper Beam isn't the only thing this applies to. End of turn effects like Poison, Leech Seed, and Burn won't apply either. This means that, theoretically, you could be up against a poisoned, low-health Tauros and still lose, because if none of your Pokemon can take a Hyper Beam, then Tauros is never going to have a recharge turn, and is never going to be finally taken out by that last little bit of poison damage. This is far from the most broken thing about Gen 1, but I do think it's interesting how something as simple as the way a turn resolves can be so drastically different here. By the second generation, Pokemon was already a much more refined experience, and there are quite a few mechanics that are series staples today that got their start here. One major mechanic that immediately became a fan favorite was shiny Pokemon. These Pokemon have an alternate color scheme and are extremely rare, making them highly sought after by fans ever since they were introduced. Modern Pokemon games have implemented ways to make shiny Pokemon easier to find, but in Generation 2, the only way to get a shiny was to get lucky and hit the 1 in 8,192 chance of finding one. Except that's actually not quite true. You see, the way that a Pokemon is determined to be shiny in Generation 2 is completely unique throughout the series. In future generations of Pokemon, whether or not a Pokemon is shiny is largely independent of other characteristics like IVs or nature. But in Generation 2, shininess is directly linked to a Pokemon's DVs. These are like IVs in later generations, except DVs have a range from 0 to 15 instead of 0 to 31. A Pokemon in Generation 2 is shiny if and only if its DVs for defense, speed, special attack, and special defense are all 10, and its attack DV is one of these values. Interestingly, this means that in Generation 2, shiny Pokemon are always suboptimal from a competitive standpoint, as you cannot have a shiny Pokemon that also has the max value of 15 in all of its stats. However, because shininess is intrinsically linked to the stats a Pokemon has, and due to the way that stats are passed from parent Pokemon to an egg when breeding, the Generation 2 games have the highest shiny rate in the whole franchise of 1 in 64 if you breed a shiny Pokemon and a non-shiny Pokemon together. Overall, I think it's a good thing to have shininess be its own independent thing, because it's fun to have Pokemon that are competitively viable that are also shiny, But it is kind of cool to have a Pokemon game where shininess is almost a genetic trait that can be passed down from parent to child in a way that almost mirrors biology in real life. Like how a cat might pass down a distinctive fur pattern to its children, or a son or daughter might inherit their eye color from one of their parents. If you want to pick up some Johto or Kanto shinies, then Generation 2 is a great place to do it. Unfortunately, I must interrupt the video at this time to deliver an urgent announcement. The residents of Mahogany Town in the Johto region are currently being terrorized by a frenzied red Gyarados rampaging across the Lake of Rage. While efforts are being made to calm this Gyarados and bring peace and safety back to the area, I must request that you subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. Doing this will help ensure that the fury of the red Gyarados is contained and allow the residents of Mahogany Town to recover from this tragic disaster. Thank you. If you've never played Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald, I highly recommend you go back and try them. They're fantastic games that introduced a lot of fan-favorite Pokemon and mechanics that would go on to define the series, such as passive abilities. As you make your way through the Hoenn region, getting all 8 gym badges and challenging the Elite Four, you'll eventually come to Glacia, a formidable Ice-type trainer. While Generation 2 introduced the sun, rain, and sand weather conditions, Hail was not introduced until Generation 3, and Glacia is here to show off what ice types can do when they're on their home turf. With 4 of her 5 Pokemon knowing the move Hail, and Acelio and her ace Walrein having Blizzard, Glacia's here to set up the Hail, chip away at any of your non-ice type Pokemon turn after turn, and deal massive damage with Blizzards that can't miss. Except there's just one little problem. Blizzard in Hail does not have its accuracy buffed at all in Generation 3. Yes, you heard me right. In the generation where they introduced the Hail weather condition into the game, Blizzard keeps its terrible 70% accuracy whether or not it's used in the Hail. This one is especially baffling to me because there was already precedent in the game for this to happen. Thunder, which is also a move that has been around since the very first generation, was buffed to not miss in the rain when rain as a weather condition was introduced in Generation 2. It would have been so easy for them to do the same thing with Hail and Blizzard in Generation 3 as a way to show off this new weather effect, but for whatever reason they decided not to, leaving Glacia out to dry while she misses Blizzard 30% of the time. It wasn't until Gen 4 when Blizzard was buffed to never miss in Hail, and that's the way it's been ever since, so at least Glacia gets to show off this synergy in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. But this does make Generation 3 the only generation of Pokemon where you can click Blizzard in the Hail and still completely miss your opponent. Magic Guard is widely considered to be one of the best abilities in competitive 6v6 singles. It's an ability that prevents its user from taking any damage at all that is not direct damage from an attack. With this ability, you are immune to burn damage, poison damage, leech seed damage, damage from stealth rocks, damage from spikes, damage from life orb, damage from recoil moves, chip damage from sandstorm or hail. I mean, this ability is crazy strong, which is why Game Freak has only ever given it to these guys. And Generation 4 is where this ability was first introduced. In Gen 4, it was only given to Clefable and its ilk. It's their signature ability this generation, and Clefable with Magic Guard is a staple of Gen 4 OU. But would you believe me if I told you that even with all the benefits Magic Guard gives its user, it's even stronger in Gen 4 than in any other generation? If you said no, you should probably reconsider, since this is a video talking about ways each Pokemon generation is unique. And in Generation 4, Magic Guard does all of the things I already mentioned, but it has one more important feature this generation only. In Gen 4, a Pokemon that has Magic Guard will not ever be fully immobilized by paralysis. Now you can still be paralyzed, and the speed reduction from the paralysis condition will apply, but Magic Guard will keep Clefable from ever losing a turn to full paralysis. Another unique feature of Magic Guard in this generation only, that isn't nearly as impactful but is just kind of interesting, is that Magic Guard also prevents you from being poisoned by toxic spikes. This one isn't as important, since even if the toxic spikes could poison you, you wouldn't be taking any damage from it regardless. But both of these features of Magic Guard were changed in subsequent generations, so Clefable and other Magic Guard users in Gen 5 onwards will have the same chance to be fully paralyzed as any other Pokemon, and will be inflicted with the poison status condition normally by toxic spikes. These nerfs aren't anything huge, but it's probably a good thing that they made these changes, because especially in Gen 6, Clefable is already strong enough, and you oftentimes need every little bit of counterplay you can get against it. So if that means hitting it with a Thunder Wave and hoping it loses a turn or two to being fully paralyzed, then go for it. The core part of Pokemon battling since the very beginning has been status conditions. Burn, paralysis, poison, freeze, and sleep have all been around in some form or another since the very beginning of the franchise. And with some exceptions, while some players might decry the extra RNG that some of these mechanics introduce, they've been considered to be mostly balanced mechanics. But in Generation 5 specifically, the 6v6 competitive battling community decided that sleep was far too strong and implemented a ban on all moves that could induce sleep in your opponent. Why? On the surface, it seems like sleep works the way you would expect. A Pokemon that is put to sleep will sleep for 1 to 3 turns, with an equal chance for each. Sounds pretty reasonable, right? This is how it works in modern generations of Pokemon too. Except in Gen 5, there's one little catch to how sleep works, and that is if you switch out a sleeping Pokemon, its sleep counter resets, as if it hadn't made it through any turns of sleep at all. This small change turns sleep from a powerful, but still manageable status condition to essentially being the equivalent of landing a free KO on an opponent's Pokemon. This is because it's not enough to just make it through 1 to 3 turns of sleep. You have to make it through 1 to 3 turns of sleep consecutively, and if you switch out, you're starting from square one. Even making it through 2 consecutive turns while your Pokemon does nothing is really difficult, not to mention leaving a Pokemon out on the field doing nothing for 3 turns in a row. And while you're not allowed to put more than one of your opponent's Pokemon to sleep at once, if you have a sleeping Pokemon in Gen 5, your 2 options are to leave it in, where it will almost certainly get KO'd, thus freeing up your opponent to just put another one of your Pokemon to sleep, or switch out the sleeping Pokemon and prevent any other of your team members from being put to sleep, but you'll just have a slot on your team that can't do anything. Either way, you're kind of screwed. For these reasons, the competitive community decided that sleep was just too much to deal with, and banned the mechanic from being used entirely. Luckily, come Gen 6, Game Freak decided to return sleep to how it had been prior, and have a Pokemon sleep counter stay consistent even if it was switched out. But this does mean that Generation 5 is the generation where sleep was at the absolute peak of its power. The 6th generation of Pokemon games made a lot of big changes. The games transitioned to 3D, Mega Evolutions were introduced, and we saw Fairy-type Pokemon join the game. Many of the changes you might associate with Gen 6 are things that have become recurring staples of the franchise, and are not necessarily unique to just Gen 6. There is one thing about Gen 6, though, that does make it unique to the games that came before and after, and it has to do with the critical hit. If you don't know, whenever you see that critical hit text box come on screen, that means a few things. Critical hits ignore any defensive buffs from the opponent, ignore any offensive debuffs your Pokemon might have had, and deal extra damage. In Generations 1 through 5, crits would deal double damage, and other than in Gen 1 where critical hit rate was tied to the base speed of a Pokemon, and you could make a whole video just on weird mechanics in Gen 1, crits had a 1 in 16 chance of happening. So that was a 1 in 16 shot every turn to ignore any relevant buffs and debuffs, and deal double damage on top of that. As you can imagine, crits were pretty impactful and relatively common to see in early generations of Pokemon battling. Game Freak must have decided that critical hits were too powerful, and decided to nerf them starting in Generation 6. From Gen 6 onward, critical hits continued to ignore the relevant buffs and debuffs from both sides of the field, but they only deal an additional 1.5 times damage instead of double. They did not, however, change the rate at which you roll critical hits. And so while modern critical hits are a 1 in 24 chance to deal 1.5 times damage to your opponent starting in Generation 7, in Gen 6 only, the critical hit is a 1 in 16 chance to get that 50% damage boost. making Gen 6 this interesting transition from the very powerful and impactful crits of Generations 1 through 5 to the more balanced and reserved critical hits of Gen 7 onward. Speed is a major component of Pokemon battling. Being able to act before your opponent is a massive advantage, and a lot of Pokemon strategy involves finding ways to move before your opponent, either by using naturally fast Pokemon, using moves with increased priority, using field effects like Tailwind or Trick Room, or utilizing items like the Choice Scarf. Up until Generation 7, turn order from Speed was completely static, and what that means is that the turn order was determined at the start of the turn, and any changes to speed wouldn't take effect until the next turn. For example, let's say you've got a Pokemon with the ability Swift Swim, which doubles its speed in the rain, and its partner uses Rain Dance. Even though the rain was set up this turn, before the Swift Swim user took its action, it would have to wait until the next turn to take advantage of its ability, since the turn order had already been determined using its unboosted speed. This means that in Generations 1 through 6, you would always have to wait a turn for any speed changes to take effect, including for any Mega Evolved Pokemon that had a higher speed stat when they Mega Evolved. This was particularly rough for quite a few Megas. Take Mega Beedrill for instance. Mega Beedrill is a hyper min-maxed Pokemon with almost all of its stats being put into its attack and speed, with minimal stats being put everywhere else. This thing is frail, but it hits fast and hard. Except on the very first turn after you Mega Evolve your Beedrill, because turn order is static, Mega Beedrill is still tied down to its pre-Mega Evolution 75 base speed. It's essentially taking a 70 base stat total hit on the first turn it's out, which is really tough to deal with. I guess the developers decided that this was kinda silly, and so when Mega Evolution returned in Generation 7, they made speed changes dynamic for Mega Evolved Pokemon only. So while you'll still need to wait a turn to get that doubled speed from Tailwind, Mega Evolved Pokemon can take advantage of an increased speed stat immediately, a huge boon for Pokemon like Mega Beedrill and Mega Metagross, who are much faster than their non-Mega Evolved counterparts. In Generation 8, turn order would become completely dynamic, with all speed changes taking effect as soon as possible, meaning you could set up a Rain Dance and have your Swift Swim partner outspeed your opponent immediately. But even with Megas seemingly returning in Generation 10, it appears that Generation 7 will be the only generation with dynamic speed for Mega Evolutions and static speed for everything else. Pokemon Sword and Shield saw quite a few major features cut from the games, which was the first time something like this had happened before in a Pokemon game. Dexit happened, with many Pokemon not being available at all in Gen 8, not even through transfer. Certain moves were deleted entirely from the game, and Mega Evolution and Z moves were removed to make way for this generation's new mechanic in Dynamax. In the Pokemon community's popular memory, Generation 8 is often remembered as a generation of removal and cutting things from the game. However, there are also things that Pokemon Sword and Shield added that were, and continue to be, completely unique, such as the Galar region's Gym Challenge. For one thing, Sword and Shield are the only games in the series where there is a Dark-type gym leader. The Dark-type has been around since the second generation of Pokemon games, but it took them until Gen 8 to have a Dark-type gym leader, and there's no Dark-type gym in Gen 9. You would think that Gen 2 would have been the perfect time to have a Dark-type gym to show off the new type. I mean, Steel was introduced at the same time, and it got its own gym in those games. But for whatever reason, Game Freak didn't think we could handle a Dark-type gym until Gen 8. One other unique feature of the gyms in Sword and Shield is that there are gym leaders who specialize in different types depending on which version of the game you're playing. If you're playing Pokemon Sword, the 4th and 6th gyms will be Fighting type and Rock type respectively, while if you picked up a copy of Pokemon Shield, you'd be dealing with Ghost types and Ice types instead. While there have been other games to have different gym leaders depending on which version you're playing, like the Dragon Gym in Black and White being led by either Drayden or Iris, this was the first, and so far the only time, where the types of certain gyms were different depending on which version you were playing. I honestly wouldn't mind seeing this come back at some point, because I think it's kind of a cool way to give some variety to the different versions of the game, but let me know what you think about this down in the comments, I'm curious to know.
It's Jigglypuff!
Finally, we arrive at Generation 9, the current generation of Pokemon at the time of uploading this video. Dynamax, Z-moves, and Mega Evolution are all gone here, and the mechanic that has ruled the Gen 9 competitive scene is Terastallization. Terastallization lets you, once per battle, change the type of one of your Pokemon to any single other type. This lets you take on the defensive and offensive characteristics of your new type, while also keeping the offensive benefits of whatever types you had before. For instance, an Iron Hands that turns into a ground type will have its weaknesses replaced by the ground type's weaknesses to water, grass, and ice, give it extra damage on ground type moves like Earthquake, and still give it extra damage on its fighting and electric type moves, which are its normal typings prior to Terastallization. A Pokemon's Terra type has to be set in advance before a battle, but with some planning it can allow you to do all sorts of things that have never been possible in a Pokemon game before. Your Steel type's about to faint to an Earthquake? Well, just turn it into a Flying type and now you're good. Your Calyrex Shadow Rider is about to get obliterated by a 4-time super effective Shadow Ball? No worries, just turn it into a normal type and take no damage at all instead. While it feels like I'm cheating a little bit by highlighting the major generational mechanic of the most current Pokemon games here in this video, I would like to bring your attention to a hidden mechanic of Terastallization that the game never tells you about, and that I don't think many people know exists. While Terastallization does all the things I just mentioned, it also has an effect on certain moves, particularly moves that have less than 60 base power. If you Terastallize and use a move that is the same type as your Terra type, if that move is less than 60 base power, it will be buffed up to 60 base power. Now this doesn't work on multi-hit moves. I mean, could you imagine if Bullet Seed had a base power of 60 for each hit? It also doesn't apply to moves that have already been boosted to at least 60 base power by the Technician ability, or moves that have increased priority. But for a Terra Rock Pokemon clicking Rock Tomb, or a Terra Electric Pokemon clicking Nuzzle, those moves each go from 50 and 20 base power respectively to 60. This also has some funny applications, like how Absorb and Mega Drain basically become the exact same move if used by a Terra Grass Pokemon. Realistically, you would just be clicking Giga Drain anyway, but I just think that's kind of funny. We'll have to see if Terastallization ever returns in the future, and whether or not the same interaction with these moves will exist. But for now, I thought it would be fun to draw attention to this kind of niche interaction that doesn't come up too often, and is kind of hidden in the background of Terastallization.
Pokemon has been a beloved franchise since its release, and it's undergone a lot of changes in the last almost 30 years. And while each new generation is largely defined by things like the Fairy type or Terastallization, I think these smaller changes to mechanics and features help make each generation feel unique and give them their own distinct character. Knowing that in Generation 4, Magic Guard will keep your Clefable from being fully paralyzed, or that in Generation 7 you can take advantage of your Mega Evolved Pokemon's newly improved speed stat immediately, are things that help differentiate each Pokemon game from each other, and it's part of what makes the series so engaging to me personally. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and learned something new about these games. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like on this video. It really helps out a lot. If you know of any niche or other unique mechanics from Pokemon games, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'd be really curious to hear about them. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.